This is part 6 of the Iron Islands. In part 5, I talked about how the Grey Irons took control of the Iron Islands, effectively ending the era of the Kingsmoot, and ruled as kings of the Iron Islands for many years. Eventually, their own people rose up against them with the help of the invading Andals, and House Grey Iron was destroyed. From there, House Hoare was selected to be the new kings of the Iron Islands. House Hoare was considered black of hair, eye, and heart, and their rule didn't go over so well with the Ironborn. As they allowed the Faith of the Seven on the Isles and eventually made changes such as no salt wives or reaving, the Ironborn liked them less and less. Finally, a drowned god priest cried out to remove Harmon Hoare, also known as Harmon the Handsome. After mutilating the king and putting him in a dungeon, Harmon's younger brother took control of the Iron Islands. And as I said last video, an absolute shit show commenced. So let's start part 6 by talking about Hagon Hoare. Hagon took over as king of the Iron Islands and soon became known as Hagon the Heartless. First, he rescinded all his brother's orders and denounced the faith, resulting in the expelling of all septons and septas from the islands. This led to every sept on the islands being lit on fire within a fortnight. But that's not where Hagon truly earned his nickname, the Cruel. Shrike, the priest whose preaching resulted in Harmon in a dungeon and Hagon on the throne, wasn't satisfied with just mutilating and stripping the throne from Hagon's brother. The priest blamed Hagon and Harmon's mother, Queen Lilia, for the shame and humiliation brought to the Ironborn. He shouted that the Lannister whore had turned her husband and sons away from the true god, and Hagon, hearing the priest's cry, took action. Which maybe he did so because he agreed with the priest, or maybe because he didn't want the same fate that happened to his brother to happen to him. So Hagon mutilated his own mother. He had her lips, ears, and eyelids cut off, and her tongue ripped out with hot pincers. Then she was bundled onto a longship and returned to her home in Lannisport. This didn't go over well with the Lannisters, and the current King of the Rock, Lilia's nephew, was so angered that he called his banners. The Lannisters went to war against the Ironborn, and it resulted in 10,000 dead, and 3/4 of the dead were Ironborn. The 7th year of the war saw the Westermen landing on Great Wick, destroying Hagon's host in battle, and capturing his castle. Because turnabout is fair play, the Lannister forces then mutilated Hagon in the same way he had done to his mother, and then they hanged him. The Lannister army commander, Sir Aubrey Crakehall, ordered the Hoare castle to be burnt to the ground, but while his men were looting, they found the mutilated Harmon the Handsome in a dungeon. Crakehall thought of putting Harmon back on the throne, but the man was half mad from his long confinement and mutilation. So instead, Crakehall gave him the gift of death, lacing a cup of wine with milk of the poppy. Then the idiot decided to claim the Iron Islands for his own. The Ironborn and Lannisters both were not happy with this decision, and the King of the Rock recalled his warships home, leaving his knight to fend for himself. Without the help of the Lannisters, King Aubrey lost his power or ability to hold the islands fairly quickly. He ruled the islands for less than half a year before he was captured and sacrificed to the sea by Shrike himself. Despite the 7 years of war and killing a lot of Ironborn, with King Aubrey gone, the Lannisters were still very pissed with the Ironborn, and they decided to continue their war for 5 more years. This war ended with the Iron Islands being impoverished, burned, and broken. The winter that followed was brutal for the Ironborn, and was remembered by them as the Famine Winter. 3 times as many Ironborn died of starvation during the winter than died in the war between the Lannisters and Ironborn. So thanks to Shrike and Hagon's actions that led to Lannister retaliation, it would take centuries before the Iron Islands would recover, and it was a long time before they reclaimed any of their power and prosperity. The kings who followed Hagon were mostly puppets of the lords and priests. There were a few good ones in there, well, good according to the Ironborn, who were like the Reavers of the Age of Heroes, such as Harrog Hoare and his son Ravos the Raper, who attacked the north in the years of the Hungry Wolf's bloody reign. Harrog conquered the Stony Shore, burned a large area of the Wolf's Wood, and took over Bear Island for a base of reaving for his son Ravos. Eventually those two were booted from the Northern Territory though, but then the Ironborn took back some Northern Territory later when Harrog's grandson, Eric the Eagle, retook Bear Island and Cape Kraken. Later, the Northerners took back that territory again. It was a lot of back and forth there. However, after taking Bear Island and Cape Kraken once more, further wars between the North and Ironborn were less decisive, and the Northerners did a fairly decent job of keeping the Ironborn out. So the Ironborn did eventually get more power, pride, and prowess, and this was mostly due to reaving and trading. Eventually, merchants and traders sailed from the harbors of Pike, Greatwick, Orkmont, and Hardlaw, and spread out, calling on Old Town, Lannisport, and the Free Cities. They returned with treasures their ancestors never dreamed of. The Ironborn would continue to reave, but in order to not provoke the mainland kings, who were building bigger and better ships at this time, they attacked distant seas in the Basilisk Isles, the Stepstones, and the shores of the disputed lands. Some Ironborn took jobs as sell sails, fighting for free cities in their endless trade wars. An example was Harwin Hoare, the third-born son of King Corwin the Cunning. Corwin had dedicated his reign to accumulating wealth and avoiding war, stating, "War is bad for trade." Of course, while he was tripling the size of his fleets and commanding his smiths to forge more armor, swords, and axes. But he explained this away, stating, "Weakness invites attack. To have peace, we must be strong." His son Harwin, who had been sent to sea at a young age, was an aggressive boy who had no love of peace, but love of his father's armor and arms he had forged. The boy sailed with a succession of reavers in the Stepstones, visited Volantis, Tyrosh, and Bravos, became a man in the pleasure gardens of Lys, spent 2 years as a captive of a pirate king in the Basilisk Isles, sold his sword to a free company in the disputed lands, and became a second son where he fought several battles. After these exciting adventures, Harwin returned to the Iron Islands to find his eldest brother 2 years dead from grayscale, his father dying, and his second brother, Harlan, the only thing between him and the crown. Harwin's brother would mysteriously die as their father was taking his last breaths, and as luck would have it, that made Harwin the next in line. Many attest that Harwin's brother Harlan simply fell from a horse, but the maesters point out that those that said so simply valued their lives. Outside the islands, many assumed it was Harwin that killed his brother for the throne, with some claiming he did the deed himself, and others believing that he had the Faceless Men do it. 6 days after Harlan's death, King Corwin died and Harwin became the new king. While Harwin's father valued trade and peace, Harwin would write his name in blood in the history books. Upon becoming king, he visited his father's shipyard and declared, "Long ships are meant to be sailed." When he saw the armories, he declared, "Swords are made to be bloodied." His father had stated that weakness invites attack, and Harwin agreed. The Riverlands were weak, with the Storm King Auric trying to control them, but the River Lords chafed under his rule. Harwin decided it would be better if he ruled the Riverlands, so he assembled a host, and with 100 of his father's longships, he traveled across the bay. They went north of Seaguard, carried their ships overland to the Blue Fork of the Trident, and then swept downstream with fire and sword. Due to his time in the disputed lands, Harwin was fierce on both sea and land, which was rare for the Ironborn. Every foe he went up against, he crushed. Though, and this was the sad state of the Riverlands, few River Lords opposed him. They mostly just let the Ironborn sweep on through. They hated their current ruler, the Storm Kings, that much. The Blackwoods did resist, but after Harwin crushed their forces, many River Lords declared for the Ironborn. The Storm King, not willing to give up the Riverlands, met Harwin at Fair Market with 1.5 times as many men. Unfortunately for the Storm King, his men were far from home, weary, and didn't have the best leadership. The Ironborn with the River Lords defeated them, and the Storm King lost 2 brothers and half his men, barely escaping with his life as he fled south. As he fled the Riverlands, small folk rose up and drove out the Storm King's garrisons or slaughtered them. The bountiful Riverlands and its wealth finally passed from the Stormlands to the Iron Men. This victory was immense for the Ironborn. Harwin had increased his holdings by 10-fold, and once again made the Iron Islands something to fear. And this is where the Lords of the Riverlands learned that maybe trading the Storm King for an Iron King wasn't a good move. The Ironborn were far more brutal, cruel, and demanding than the Storm Kings. The Riverlords tried to fight back, but Harwin would quickly crush any rebellion. He spent more of his reign in the Riverlands than the islands, riding from one end of the Trident to the other, stopping rebellions, collecting taxes, salt wives, and tribute. It was said, his place was a tent, his throne a saddle. Harwin died at 64, and his son Halleck took the throne. He ruled much like his father, though bloodier and with less success. Though he did manage to extend his domain east to Duskendale and Rosby, he had many unsuccessful wars against the Westermen and Stormlanders, and failed at least 3 times to conquer the Vale, all ending in disaster at the Bloody Gate. Though Halleck called himself Ironborn, worshipped the drowned god, and always had 3 priests at his side, there was more trident than salt in his veins, and he viewed the islands only as a source of arms, men, and ships. During his rule, he only visited the Iron Islands 3 times, spending less than 2 years total on the Isles. Instead, he spent most of his time in camp tents, always on campaign. When not being a little warlord, he ruled from a modest tower house at Fair Market, which was the heart of the Riverlands and near the site of his father's greatest victory. When he passed, his son Harren came to the throne. Harren was unfortunate, as Aegon the Conqueror would come to Westeros during his rule and basically kick his teeth in, or more like roast him alive. Harren will have his own video because I can't get enough of the time period of the Targaryens in Westeros, and honestly, this guy was so full of himself, I love it. Following his video, I'll talk about the Greyjoys taking over the Iron Islands and their somewhat choppy history as rulers. So make sure you hit the thumbs up button, it helps the channel out a lot, and thank you for watching.